Legacy is not inherited. It is not passed down through deeds and titles and the handshake of one generation to the next. Legacy is planted. It is pushed into broken ground with bare hands in the cold while other people watch and laugh. And sometimes the person doing the planting is the only one who understands what they are actually building. This is the story of Opal Hollins, a 28-year-old woman who came home to a dying farm with a plan nobody believed. It is the story of 340 trees planted one at a time along a barren fence line, while 4 men stood at the wire and made jokes about sticks and wasted soil. It is the story of what happened 4 years later when the numbers came in and what those numbers said about patience and knowledge and the particular kind of courage it takes to keep digging when everyone around you has already decided you are wrong. But before any of that, there was a morning in March of 2019 and a woman on her knees in the dark. Opal pulled into the long gravel drive of the Hollins farm just before 6 in the morning. She had driven through the night from Columbia, her truck loaded with 2 duffel bags, a set of soil testing equipment she had borrowed from her thesis advisor, and 4 years of research printed and bound into a single manila folder that sat on the passenger seat like a quiet argument waiting to be made. The sky over Callaway County was the color of old pewter flat and without promise. She had not called ahead. She had not told her mother exactly when she was coming back. She saw Vera before she reached the barn. Her mother was 68 feet from the barn door, both hands wrapped around the metal coupling of a water line that had kinked and locked somewhere in the drag across the yard. The line was heavy with overnight cold. Vera Hollins was 58 years old, and she was pulling with everything she had, her boots dug into the mud, her breath coming in short, visible bursts in the March air. She was not calling for help. She was just pulling. Opal stopped the truck, got out, did not say anything. She walked to the other end of the line, found where it had doubled back on itself against the corner post, lifted it straight, and the whole thing released with a sound like a held breath. Vera straightened up, looked at her daughter for a moment, then she said simply, "You're back." Not a question, not a welcome, just a recognition of fact, the way farmers talk when there is too much work and not enough time for ceremony. Opal said yes. Vera picked up the end of the line and began walking it toward the water tank. Opal picked up the other end and walked with her. They got the job done without another word, and that was the beginning of everything. Inside at the kitchen table, Vera made coffee without being asked. She placed 2 cups down, sat across from her daughter, and put a worn composition notebook on the table between them. The cover had a water stain on it, shaped like a thumb. Opal opened it. She did not ask permission. She read the numbers in silence, turning pages slowly, and the coffee went cold beside her. 120 acres, 8 years of single-handed operation, equipment debt carried forward from 2015, fertilizer input costs up 34% over the past 3 years alone, net profit for the previous calendar year, $4,200. Opal closed the notebook, set it back on the table, exactly where Vera had placed it. Vera said, "Do you have a plan?" Opal said yes. Vera said, "Good." She picked up her coffee and drank. The conversation was over. That was how Vera Hollins had survived 8 years alone, and Opal recognized it for what it was not coldness, but the discipline of a woman who had learned to move from problem to action without wasting anything in between. Later that morning, Opal walked the east fence line alone. She had read about it in her research. She had looked at it on satellite maps and county soil surveys and USDA erosion data that went back to 1985. But standing on it was something different. The east boundary of the Hollins property stretched for just over a quarter mile, and the soil along that line had been losing the argument with the wind for 30 years. Wind erosion had stripped the edge down 6 inches below the level of the field center, leaving a long exposed ridge of compacted clay subsoil the color of old ash. Nothing grew along it except a few brittle weeds that looked embarrassed to be there. The neighboring field on the other side of the wire was in the same condition, maybe worse. Opal crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the ground. She could feel the texture of it through her skin. Dead. Not poison, not diseased, just abandoned and exposed and slowly being carried away by the wind season after season until there was almost nothing left to carry. She was still crouched there when the red pickup truck pulled up on the other side of the fence. The man who got out was broad-shouldered and unhurried, the kind of person who takes his time getting out of a vehicle because he has learned that arriving slowly makes other people wait, and making people wait establishes something. He leaned against his door and looked at Opal for a moment without introducing himself. "Wiley Sorrell," he said finally. "My property runs along yours from the North Post to the county road." Opal stood up. "Opal Hollins, I know who you are." He looked out at the barren edge soil with the practiced eye of a man who had been farming the same ground for 30 years. "Your father used to stand in that same spot, look the same way you're looking now. Did he?" Everybody around here knew Arlo Hollins. Wiley paused just long enough to let that settle. "I talked to your mother last fall about this 20 acres along the east edge, offered her a fair price, told her the soil is done." "You told her it was done." "It's the truth." Opal looked at the ground between them. Then she looked back at Wiley. "What do you want for it?" Wiley smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Same thing I said to Vera. Fair price. Better than what you'll get trying to farm it." "I'm not trying to farm it." There was a pause. Wiley tilted his head slightly. "What are you going to do with it?" Opal said, "Something else." Wiley looked at her for another moment, then he got back into his red truck and drove north without looking back. Opal watched the truck until it disappeared past the tree line at the corner of his property. Then she looked back at the dead soil at her feet, and she thought about what Leland Teller had told her on the phone 2 weeks ago, before she had driven back from Columbia, before she had told anyone she was coming home. Leland had said the soil is not dead. It just has not been protected. Leland Teller worked out of the Callaway County Extension Office on the county road east of Fulton. He had been a county agricultural extension agent for 11 years, and he had spent 4 of those years writing letters to farmers about a method of windbreak management and agroforestry design that the USDA had been documenting for decades. He had written 23 letters. He had received 0 responses. When Opal Hollins called him on a Tuesday morning in late February, he was sitting at his desk in front of a computer screen with a transfer request form open in the window. He had not filled it in yet. He was just looking at it. He closed it when he heard her voice. He arrived at the Hollins farm 40 minutes after Opal called him from the fence line. He drove a county-issued pickup with a magnetic placard on the door and a folder on the passenger seat that was considerably thicker than Opal's. When he got out, Opal noticed that the folder had tabs, color-coded tabs, the kind a person makes when they have been organizing something for a long time and have never been given the chance to use it. Leland set the folder on the hood of his truck and opened it. He did not say hello first. He said, "You called me back." Opal said, "You left a message 3 weeks ago with my thesis advisor saying you'd been tracking native species windbreak performance in this county for 4 years and you had data." "I do. I want to see it." Leland looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has been disappointed many times and has learned to take hope slowly. Then he turned to the second tab in his folder and laid out the first set of charts. What Leland Teller had spent 4 years documenting was this: when native species trees are planted in a properly spaced line along a windward edge of an agricultural field, they disrupt the lateral movement of wind across the soil surface. USDA studies going back to the 1970s had shown that a functioning windbreak reduces wind erosion by up to 75% within a protected zone that extends approximately 10 times the mature tree height on the leeward side. In that protected zone, soil moisture increases measurably because the wind is no longer stripping evaporated water from the surface, and when the native species selected are nitrogen-fixing varieties, those trees do something else entirely. Their root systems deposit nitrogen compounds into the surrounding soil at documented rates of 40 to 80 pounds per acre annually, with no synthetic input required. The fence line, in other words, could become a free fertilizer system, a living soil restoration engine that worked while the farmer slept. 340 saplings of hawthorn wild, plum and serviceberry, all native to central Missouri, all county approved, all nitrogen fixing. Total cost $680. Opal listened to all of it. When Leland finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me all of it again. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing." Leland looked at her. "You already knew this. I researched it before I came home, but I want to hear you say it, because when this works, I'm going to need someone who has been saying the same thing for 4 years standing next to me." That was when Leland Teller closed the transfer request form for good. There was one more thing to find before the planting began. Arlo Hollins's study was the smallest room in the farmhouse, tucked behind the kitchen, and Vera had left it exactly as it was when Arlo walked out in the spring of 2014. The farm maps were still pinned to the wall. The calendar on the desk had stopped in March of that year, and under a smooth river stone shaped like the back of a horse, there was a single folded piece of paper. Opal unfolded it. On one side, in her father's handwriting, large and certain, East Fence Line, "Do not plant trees, Arlo H., 1998. She turned it over. The handwriting on the back was different, smaller, the letters pressed harder into the paper the way a person writes when their hand is not quite steady. "Tried once, wrong season, wrong species. Don't let them laugh at you the way they laughed at me." Opal stood in that small room for a long time. She brought the paper to Leland Teller the next morning. Leland looked at both sides. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then he said, "Your father tried to plant a windbreak in the fall of 1997. He used commercial nursery stock, not native species. The root systems weren't adapted to Callaway County soil chemistry. Every tree died before spring." He paused. He didn't know why. Nobody told him why, because nobody in the county was working with native species at that time. He just saw the trees die and drew the wrong conclusion from a failed experiment that was never properly designed. Opal said, "He thought the land couldn't hold trees." Leland said, "He thought he couldn't make it hold trees. That's different, and it's the kind of mistake that follows a man." Opal folded the paper once and put it in the front pocket of her field shirt. She kept it there every day she went out to work the fence line. She did not tell anyone why. The saplings arrived on a Wednesday. 340 small trees packed in wet burlap and cardboard, stacked in the bed of the delivery truck with the careful arrangement of something that had traveled a long distance and needed to arrive intact. Opal had the holes mapped out. She had calculated the spacing, the depth, the soil amendment needed at each position. She started at the south end of the fence line at 5:30 in the morning before the neighbors were out, and she worked north. By the time Clem Lorne showed up at the wire, Opal was 47 trees in. Clem Lorne was 57 years old with a face that had been worked over by 30 Missouri summers and a way of speaking that suggested he had spent most of his life being right about things. He farmed corn and soybeans on the 220 acres west of the county road, and he had strong opinions about soil management that had served him adequately for 3 decades. He stood at the fence with his coffee thermos and watched Opal work with the particular interest of a man who has already decided what he is looking at. "Girl," he said, though he said it without real malice, the way an older man sometimes speaks to a younger woman when he is trying to be helpful and does not realize he is being condescending, "you are putting your best edge soil under sticks." Opal drove her spade into the ground, did not look up. "That edge soil is gone anyway, but you could be getting wind erosion payments on it. Crop insurance covers fence line damage now. You plant these things, you take yourself off that program." He took a drink of coffee. "Your daddy tried something like this once. You know how that went." Opal lifted a sapling from the burlap wrap, placed it in the hole, and pressed the root ball down with both hands. She did not answer. She moved to the next position and started digging again. Clem watched for another few minutes, then he drove back up the county road to his own fields. He came back the next morning with 2 other men. Wiley Sorrell was not among them, but Wiley Sorrell had his own way of making his presence felt. That afternoon, while Opal was working the north end of the fence line, Wiley knocked on the front door of the farmhouse. Vera answered. She was still holding a dish towel when Wiley delivered the point of his visit, which was this. He told Vera that what Opal was doing to the east edge soil was going to create root competition issues along the property boundary and reduce water absorption on his side of the fence during dry periods. He said he had spoken to someone at the county planning office. He said he was just making sure Vera was aware of the situation before it became something more formal. He said the price he had offered for that 20 acres was still available, and in his experience it was better to make these decisions before a project reached the point of no return. Vera stood at the door with the dish towel in her hands and listened to all of it. When Wiley finished, she said, "I appreciate you coming by, Wiley." Then she said, "The answer is still no." Then she closed the door. When Opal came in that evening, Vera was at the stove. She did not turn around. She said, "Wiley Sorrell stopped by." She said nothing else about it. Opal looked at her mother's back, at the set of her shoulders, and understood that Vera had handled it and considered it handled and did not want to make more of it than it was. Opal washed her hands at the sink. They ate dinner together without discussing Wiley Sorrell or the East Fence Line or the 20 acres or anything else that mattered. That night, Opal sat alone in the barn with a work lantern and her field notebook open on the workbench in front of her. The notebook already had soil data, measurements, and a hand-drawn map of the planting positions. She had filled 9 pages in 2 days. She opened to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, "Day 2, 180 of 340 trees planted. Back is bad. Right hand blistered through the gloves. Dad failed here in 1997. She stopped, read that last sentence, then wrote below it, "Dad used the wrong trees. I am not using the wrong trees." She underlined that sentence once. Then she closed the notebook and turned off the lantern and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind move across the fields outside, doing the slow, invisible work of carrying things away. She did not know that a gray pickup truck had slowed on the county road twice that afternoon, and that the woman behind the wheel had sat there watching Opal work with an expression that was not casual curiosity. The woman had a clipboard on the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee, and she had been coming back to this particular stretch of road for 3 days before today. Leland Teller knew who she was and had not said anything yet. He had his reasons. On the 3rd morning, Opal finished the last of the 340 trees by 2 in the afternoon. She walked the entire fence line from south to north, checking each tree, pressing the soil tighter at the base of the ones that had shifted in the wind overnight. The trees were small. They were 18 to 24 inches tall, which at the scale of a quarter-mile fence line looked like almost nothing like a child's effort, like exactly the kind of thing that a man standing at a wire with a coffee thermos might call a waste of good soil. Clem Lorne made his final pass of the day just as Opal reached the north end of the line. He slowed the truck and leaned out the window. "Well," he said, looking at the row of small saplings, "looks good, I'll say that. Be nice firewood in about 4 years." He drove on without waiting for a response. Opal did not watch him go. She was looking north at the full length of what she had planted, at 340 small living things standing in a row against the sky, and she thought about a man who had stood in this same field in 1997 with the wrong trees and the right idea and no one beside him who understood what he was trying to do. She put her hand into the front pocket of her field shirt and felt the folded paper there. That was the evening Vera finally told her. They were at the kitchen table after dinner. Vera had her hands flat on the table, not around a coffee cup, not folded in her lap. She was looking at Opal directly. She said, "I need to tell you something about your father and that fence line." Opal waited. Vera told her about 1999. Arlo Hollins had been serving his 2nd term on the Callaway County Agricultural Advisory Board that year. A proposal had come forward for a county-wide agroforestry pilot program. the first of its kind in central Missouri. It would have placed native species windbreaks on participating farms at shared cost with technical support from the University of Missouri Extension. Arlo had read the proposal and read the supporting research, and he had done what he rarely did in his life, which was argue. He had argued for that proposal across 3 separate board meetings against 4 men who voted it down. Every time, the same 4 men who came back every time with the same objections. It was unproven, it was expensive, it was not how things had been done, and there was no good reason to change what was working. Arlo had gone home after the 3rd vote and gone out to the east fence line the next morning. He had tried it alone, and the trees had died, and the men on the board had not said "I told you so," which was almost worse, because their silence meant they had already stopped thinking about it. Vera said, "He didn't write that note to stop you, Opal. He wrote it to stop himself from trying again because he couldn't survive losing again. It wasn't a warning, it was a bandage." Opal was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did he know about Leland Teller?" Vera shook her head. "Leland came to the county in 2015. Your father left in the spring of 2014. Opal took the folded paper from her shirt pocket and held it on the table between her hands without opening it. Vera looked at it and did not say anything. After a while, Opal said, "He was right about the fence line. He was just too early and too alone." Vera said yes. Opal put the paper back in her pocket. She stood up and said good night to her mother and went upstairs. She did not cry. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling of the room she had grown up in and thought about what it cost a man to be right about something and have no one believe him. And she thought about the difference between that and her own situation, and the difference was Leland Teller and Inez Greer, who was still a gray truck on a county road and a clipboard and a thermos not yet a name. She was out at 5:20 the next morning. The 12 trees at the north end of the fence line had been pulled from the ground in the night, not broken, not mowed down, pulled up roots and all and laid on the county road shoulder with a kind of deliberateness that was not accidental and was not the wind. Opal stood and looked at them for a moment. The soil in the 12 empty holes was loose and dark against the pale clay of the surrounding ground. She went back to the barn. She got her spade. She came back to the north end and started digging the first hole again. It took 2 hours to replant all 12 trees. When Leland Teller arrived at 7:30, the work was done and Opal was standing at the fence line drinking water from a metal bottle. Leland looked at the fresh-turned soil around the 12 trees at the north end. He looked at the rest of the line. Then he said quietly, "Someone wants you to stop." Opal took a drink of water and looked north along the fence line at 340 trees standing in the March light, small and bare, and already beginning the slow, invisible work of changing the ground beneath them. She said they pulled up the wrong ones. Nobody in Callaway County talked about the Hollins fence line for the first 8 months. Then Wiley Sorrell filed a formal complaint with the county planning office, and after that, everybody talked about it. The complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, typed on letterhead 3 pages long. Leland Teller read it at his desk with his coffee going cold beside him. Wiley had argued with considerable care and in bureaucratic language that suggested he had not written it alone, that the planting of non-commercial woody species along a shared property boundary constituted a potential drainage interference and root encroachment issue under County Agricultural Zoning Code, Section 14.7. He had attached 2 pages of supporting citations. He had not mentioned Opal Hollins by name anywhere in the document. He had referred throughout to the adjacent property. Leland called Opal that afternoon. He said, "Wiley is playing by the rules." Then he said, "We have to play by the rules too." Opal said, "Tell me what we need." What they needed was a technical response document demonstrating that all 3 planted species appeared on the USDA native plant lists for Callaway County, that none of the 3 species had documented evidence of invasive root behavior in central Missouri soil conditions, and that the planting design met or exceeded county setback requirements from the shared property line. They also needed 8 months of field data. Opal had 8 months of field data. She had been taking soil samples at 4 positions along the fence line every 30 days and recording wind speed measurements at 7 stake positions every Monday morning since the week after planting. She had never missed a week. Leland drove out to the farm on a Thursday evening after his office closed. They sat at the kitchen table, Opal's field notebooks spread between them, and they built the response document together. Vera moved around the kitchen behind them, making supper, not participating, but present in the way that farmers are present when something important is being decided at their table. It took 2 weeks. Opal wrote in the evenings after the day's farm work was done, her field notebooks open beside her laptop, translating handwritten measurements into tables and charts that could stand before a county board without apology. The data from those first 8 months was not dramatic. The trees were still under 3 feet. What the data showed clearly and without embellishment was a trend. Wind speed at the fence line had decreased by an average of 18% compared to Opal's baseline measurements. Soil surface moisture at the 2 positions nearest the tree line was retaining detectably longer after rainfall events. Leland submitted the response on a Monday. Wiley's complaint was dismissed 11 days later. It was during the preparation of that response document that Leland found the 1999 file. He had been pulling archived county records to confirm the native species classifications, working through a filing cabinet in the back room of the extension office that held county agricultural board minutes going back to 1987. He found the folder by accident wedged between 2 thicker folders from 2001. It was thin 4 pages stapled once. The cover page read Callaway County Agroforestry Windbreak Pilot Program, Proposed 2000 Implementation Board Review, October 1999. Leland read through it. Then he drove out to the farm that same evening and gave it to Opal without explanation. Opal read it at the kitchen table. The proposal was detailed and well-sourced, citing the same USDA literature she had used in her own research. It called for windbreak installation on 6 participating farms in the county using native species with cost-sharing through a state agriculture development fund. At the bottom of the last page in the board vote record were 5 names. 4 had the word opposed written next to them. 1 had approved. The name next to approved was Arlo Hollins. Opal set the papers down flat on the table. She put her hand on top of them. Then she said, "He tried to get this done for the whole county." Leland said he was the only vote for it. Opal said, and then he went home and tried it alone and failed and never told anyone why. Leland said nothing. Opal picked the papers up and folded them once and put them under her field notebook. She did not talk about it further that evening. But that night, sitting alone in Arlo's old study with just the desk lamp on, she took the folded paper from her shirt pocket and set it next to the 1999 board document on the desk, the two pieces of her father side by side, the man who had been right and had paid for being right in ways that took years to understand. She sat there for a long time in the quiet. 3 weeks after the complaint was dismissed, Clem Lorne organized a meeting. Opal did not know about it at the time. Leland found out through Vance Tanner, who was a member of the County Agricultural Advisory Board and who had received the following week a letter. The letter was signed by Clem, Lorne, Wiley Sorrell, and 2 other Callaway County farmers whose names Opal recognized from the county extension newsletter. It was addressed to Vance Tanner in his capacity as board member, and it requested that the board review the criteria by which cost sharing and operational support resources are allocated to farms employing non-traditional agricultural methods within the county. Leland read the letter aloud to Opal over the phone. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many people signed it?" Leland said 4. Opal said, "Who is Vance Tanner?" Leland said he's been on the board for 11 years. He's not Wiley Sorrell's ally, but he's not a risk taker. He moves slowly. He wants documentation before he forms an opinion. Opal said, "Then we give him documentation." It was the right answer, but it came from a place she had not fully acknowledged yet, which was that the ground beneath this project was shifting from her own fence line to the county's political geography, and those were different kinds of ground with different kinds of roots, and she was less certain of the terrain. The year turned. By the following May, the trees along the east fence line were 3 feet tall, and on certain mornings, if you stood at the south end and looked north, you could see the line of them holding against the wind, while the unprotected field surface to the west moved and shifted with the gusts the way it always had. It was not a dramatic difference. It was the difference between a thing that was changing and a thing that was not, and that kind of difference requires patience to see. Opal was measuring it. She measured it every week in every weather, in mud and in heat, and she wrote down what she found in notebooks that were already beginning to fill a dedicated shelf above the workbench in the barn. It was on a Tuesday morning in early June, while Opal was checking the stake positions along the north end of the fence, that the gray pickup appeared again. She had not seen it since the 3rd day of planting. She had asked Leland about it twice and received answers that did not quite satisfy her. Now it was pulled off the county road 50 yards north of the fence line, and the woman behind the wheel was already getting out. Ines Greer was 44 years old. She had a doctorate in soil science from the University of Missouri and a joint appointment with the MU Extension Program and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service that gave her a level of institutional independence unusual for a person her age. She was wearing a field jacket with 2 breast pockets and carrying a clipboard that had seen considerable outdoor use. She did not extend her hand when she reached Opal. She looked at the fence line first. She walked it from south to north without speaking, stopping occasionally to crouch down and look at the soil surface at the base of the trees, pressing 2 fingers into the ground in several places, standing again and making notes. Opal walked behind her and said nothing. When Ines reached the north end, she turned around and looked back at the full length of the planting. Then she looked at Opal. She said, "I've been watching this fence line since the week after you planted it, from the road." Opal said, "I know." Ines said, "I've seen a lot of windbreak plantings in this county and in 3 counties adjacent. Most of them fail in year 1 or year 2. Wrong species, wrong spacing, or the farmer loses patience and converts the ground back to row crop before the root system establishes." She paused. "You're using the right species at the correct spacing and your trees are healthy. What I want to know is whether you understand why or whether you got lucky." Opal said, "I have 14 months of soil and wind data in the barn. Would you like to look at it?" Ines said, "That's what I drove out here for." They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with Opal's notebooks. Ines moved through the data methodically, the way a scientist reads, not linearly, but by comparison, checking measurements from one position against another, looking for the patterns that individual numbers do not show. Vera brought coffee and did not stay. At one point, Ines put her pen down and looked at the notebooks without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "Your measurement protocol is consistent. That matters more than the equipment." Opal said, "I couldn't afford better equipment." Ines said, "I know. The consistency is why the data is usable." It was the closest thing to a compliment she offered that afternoon. 2 weeks later, Ines called Opal with a proposal. She wanted to write a paper. She had been working with MU Extension on a regional native species windbreak performance study for 2 years, and the Hollins farm data fit a gap in that study that she had not been able to fill with any other site in central Missouri. She wanted to include the fence line measurements in a journal article she was preparing for submission to the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. Opal said no. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds. Ines said, "The data supports publication. The measurements are sound and the methodology is reproducible." Opal said, "I understand that. This kind of documentation helps every farmer in the region who is considering a windbreak investment. It creates a scientific record that cannot be dismissed the way a single farmer's field observations can be dismissed." Opal said, "And it gives Wiley Sorrell and Clem Lorne a peer-reviewed document they can point to and say the experiment is incomplete because there are no yield numbers yet. They will use your credibility against my results. You will write a careful, qualified paper, and they will quote the qualifications. I need a harvest number first. When I have a yield number, you can write whatever you want." There was another silence. Ines said, "That is not how science is supposed to work." Opal said, "I know, but this is not a laboratory. It's a farm, and the people trying to undercut it are not going to respect the scientific process." Ines said, "You're letting the opposition dictate your strategy." Opal said, "I'm letting the reality of my situation dictate my strategy. Those are different things." Ines ended the call without agreeing to anything. Opal sat at the kitchen table after the phone on the wood in front of her and considered the possibility that she had just argued away her most credentialed ally over a tactical calculation that might turn out to be wrong. She did not pick up the phone. She looked out the window at the east field at the fence line, where the trees were now dense enough to cast an actual shadow in the morning light, and she told herself she had time. Year 1 was not yet finished. She had time. 3 weeks after that phone call, Inez Greer showed up at the farm without notice. She was carrying a rolled paper tube under one arm. She set it on the hood of her truck and unrolled it. It was a thermal satellite image printed at 24 by 36 inches, showing a section of Callaway County that Opal recognized immediately because she could see the irregular shape of the Hollins property in the lower left quadrant. The image showed 4 farms. Opal's was the only one with a visible temperature gradient along its east boundary, a long, narrow band of cooler, darker color running the length of the fence line, bleeding into the field on the west side for a distance that Opal estimated at roughly 30 to 40 feet. She looked at the other 3 farms on the image. One of them she recognized by boundary shape as Wiley Sorrell's property. His east and north boundaries were a consistent warm red tone, unbroken the same color as the field centers. Inez said, "Thermal differential indicates soil surface moisture retention. The band along your fence line is measurably cooler and moister than the surrounding field, which corresponds with your soil sample data. The effect is already extending into the field at twice the tree height." She let Opal look at the image for a moment. Then she said, "The farm in the upper right is losing topsoil at a rate the owner may not be aware of. The thermal signature along his north boundary has degraded by about 12% compared to images from 3 years ago." Opal looked at the property shape in the lower right and said, "That's Wiley Sorrell's land." Inez said yes. Opal was quiet. Then she said, "He's been watching my fence line because he's trying to protect something he doesn't know how to fix." Inez said nothing. She re-rolled the image carefully and put it back in the tube. Before she got in her truck, she said, "I'll hold the paper, but I want your soil data from year 2 when you have it." Opal said, "You'll have it." The summer dried out in August. It was not a disaster by historical standards. It was 6 weeks without meaningful rainfall, which in a normal year was manageable for established crops with good soil moisture reserves. In 2020, after 3 consecutive years of reduced precipitation across central Missouri, 6 weeks without rain was enough to matter. Opal watched the center field show stress by the 3rd week. The leaves of the vegetable crops along the interior rows began to curl at the edges in the afternoon heat, a visible signal of moisture drawdown in the root zone. She walked the rows every evening and checked soil moisture by hand at 12 positions across the center field. The edge rows, the ones within 40 feet of the fence line, held longer. She could see it before she measured it. The plants in the protected zone stayed upright later into the afternoon. Their leaves did not curl until after the plants in the center had already been curling for 2 hours. When she pulled moisture readings, the numbers confirmed what she could see. The edge zone was retaining soil moisture at a rate that the center field could not match, and the difference was widest on the hottest days, which was exactly when it mattered most. The drought hurt the Hollins farm. There was no way to say otherwise. When Opal and Vera sat at the kitchen table at the end of September and went through the numbers for the season, the picture was not good. The drought had taken a measurable piece of the year's production, and the farm had been running on margins that did not have room for measurable losses. Vera opened the composition notebook with the water stain on the cover and set it on the table between them without preamble. Opal read the numbers. Then she looked up at her mother. "How long do we have?" Vera said, "If nothing changes, 18 months, maybe a little more if we reduce equipment expenditure this fall." Opal said, "You knew this before I came back." Vera said, "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the last of the summer crickets were audible through the window glass. Vera's hands were on the table, not folded, just resting, and Opal looked at those hands, the knuckles enlarged from years of work, the skin roughened by every season she had spent keeping this farm running without help, and she understood something she had not fully understood before, which was that Vera Hollins had not called her home. She had waited for Opal to come home on her own, because asking for help was not something Vera Hollins was built to do, and so 8 years had passed without the asking, and now 18 months remained. Opal said, "We are going to call Leland Teller tomorrow morning." Vera said, "All right." Leland arrived the next afternoon. Opal had already called Inez, who drove out the same evening. They sat around the kitchen table, the four of them, and for the first time, Opal laid out the full constraint of the situation in plain language. She said they had 18 months of operating capital. She said that if year 3 did not produce documented results strong enough to support a premium sales contract, the farm would need to consider selling acreage to remain solvent. She said Wiley Sorrell had made his intentions clear from the first week she had come home, and she had no interest in providing him with the opportunity he was waiting for. Then she looked at Leland and said, "You mentioned a federal cost share program when we were first planning the planting, EQIP. You said I might qualify for expansion funding in year 3. Leland opened his laptop. He had the program pulled up before he set it on the table, which told Opal he had been thinking about this too. He said, USDA Environmental Quality Incentives Program, cost share for qualifying conservation practices, including windbreak establishment and expansion, up to 75% reimbursement. You qualify for a year 3 expansion application, but you need documented year 2 data to support the technical narrative in the application. Opal looked at Inez. Inez said, "Give me the notebooks." That was the moment the three of them became something different from what they had been individually, not a farmer and an extension agent and a soil scientist orbiting the same project, but a unit with a shared deadline and a clear understanding of what it would cost each of them if the deadline was not met. Inez wrote the technical narrative for the EQIP application herself over 2 weekends in October, using Opal's soil sample data and wind measurements and the thermal satellite imagery she had been collecting since planting. Leland handled the submission paperwork and the county office coordination. Opal kept the farm running. The EQIP application was approved in February of year 3. Vance Tanner drove out to the Hollins farm in March of that year unannounced in a county vehicle with no magnetic placard on the door. Opal was working near the barn when he arrived. She did not know who he was until he introduced himself. He was 62 years old, with the unhurried demeanor of a man who had spent a long career in county governance, learning to look before he spoke. He stood at the gate and looked at the fence line for a while. The trees were 6 feet tall, now visible from the road as a continuous dark line against the pale sky, substantial in a way that the first-year saplings had not been. Vance said, "I received the letter from Clem Lorne and the others 2 years ago. I want you to know I did not act on it." Opal said, "Why not?" Vance said, "Because it was not a request for action. It was a request for me to take a position before I had any basis for a position." He looked at the trees again. "I came out here because the EQIP approval went across my desk last week, and I wanted to see what the money was going toward before I heard about it from someone else." Opal said, "Do you want to walk the line?" Vance said, "That's what I came for." He spent 90 minutes at the fence line. He asked 3 questions the entire time, all of them specific, none of them hostile. Before he left, he stood at the south end and looked north along the full length of the planting and said the last Callaway County farm to set a county yield record was in 2009. I remember the day that report came out. He walked back to his car without elaborating. Opal watched him go and could not decide whether what he had said was encouragement or a warning or simply an observation, and she decided it did not matter because she was not farming for Vance Tanner's approval. She was farming for the numbers, and the numbers were coming. By July, the Eastfield Edge was outperforming the Field Center by 22% per acre. The protected zone extended 40 feet from the tree line. The data was not ambiguous. When Inez came out for her monthly soil sampling, that month she stood at the center of the protected zone and ran her hand through the soil at ankle depth without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "Your edge organic matter is now 18% higher than your center field. Moisture retention in this zone is 23% higher than the most eroded positions." She stood up and brushed the soil off her hands. "The fence line is feeding the field." Opal wrote it in her notebook, all of it in the same handwriting, in the same notebook she had been filling for 2.5 years. In August, she got a phone call from Leland Teller. He said, "Do you know a woman named Hazel Pruitt?" Opal said she did not. Leland said, "She runs procurement for a regional organic food network out of St. Louis. She called my office yesterday. She heard about the fence line and the yield numbers through the extension newsletter I published in June. She wants to come see the farm." Opal said, "She's welcome to come." Leland said, "Opal, she is a serious buyer. She moves volume for 3 grocery chains in Missouri and 2 in Illinois. If she likes what she sees here, the conversation she wants to have is not about one season." There was a pause. Opal said, "When can she come?" On a Wednesday in late August, Hazel Pruitt drove 4 hours from St. Louis to Callaway County in a blue Subaru that still had a city parking permit on the windshield. She arrived at 8 in the morning in a rain jacket and boots, which Opal noted with approval. Leland and Inez were both present. Opal had not asked them to come. They had offered, and she had accepted because she understood that what Hazel Pruitt was looking at was not just a fence line and a yield number, but an entire system, and the system included the people who had built it. Hazel walked for 2 hours. She did not take notes. She did not ask questions while she walked. She moved through the field rows slowly, the way someone walks when they are forming a judgment and do not want the judgment interrupted. At the fence line, she stopped and stood for a long time. Opal stood 10 feet back and let her stand. When Hazel came back to where the four of them were waiting near the barn, she said, 3-year premium organic purchase contract, 26% above market rate. Then she said, one condition, the agroforestry system stays in place and expands, not optional. Then she said, the trees are part of the contract value. If the trees come out, the contract ends. She said it with the flat practicality of a buyer who had been in the field long enough to understand that the thing producing the quality she was purchasing was not the seed or the irrigation or the labor. It was the system, the whole interconnected system, the trees and the soil and the moisture and the nitrogen, everything working together in a way that could not be separated without losing the thing she was buying. Opal said, I understand. They agreed on terms. Documents would follow from Hazel's legal team within 2 weeks. It was during the brief reception at the kitchen table afterward, coffee and the blueberry pie Vera had made, without mentioning it to anyone, that Hazel said something that changed the temperature of the room. She said casually, the way people mention things they assume are already known. I reached out to this farm about 18 months ago, actually. I'd heard something through the network about the fence line project, and I sent an email to the general contact address. When I didn't hear back, I assumed the operation wasn't in a position to discuss contracts yet. Opal set her coffee cup down. She looked at Vera. Vera's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the coffee in her cup, not at Opal, and the angle of her head said everything before any word was spoken. Hazel seemed to sense something and moved the conversation to logistics. Leland asked a question about delivery scheduling. The moment passed. Opal did not say anything until that night. She waited until Hazel's car was gone, and Leland and Inez were gone, and the kitchen had been cleaned up, and Vera was sitting at the table in the quiet of the house. Then Opal sat down across from her and said without raising her voice, You received Hazel Pruitt's email. Vera said yes. 18 months ago, when we had 18 months of operating capital left. Vera said, I did not know who she was or whether she was serious. You had just started year 2. The trees were 3 feet tall. I did not want you taking on a contract obligation before you had proof that the system could deliver what the contract required. Opal said, That was my decision to make. Vera said, I know that. You made it for me. Vera looked at her then. I have been making every decision on this farm alone for 8 years, Opal. I did not know how to stop. The kitchen was very quiet. Opal looked at her mother, at the woman who had pulled water lines at 5 in the morning alone for 8 years and opened the financial notebook without asking for sympathy and closed the door on Wiley Sorrell without needing anyone to do it for her. She said, I'm not angry with you. Vera said, I know, but you should be. Opal said, What I am is clear. Going forward, the farm's information is shared. All of it. Every email, every offer, every contact. We decide together. Vera said, All right. Opal said, All right. Neither of them moved for a while. The clock on the wall marked the seconds. Outside, the east field was dark, and the trees along the fence line were invisible against the night sky, but present the way anything is present when its roots go deep enough. 2 weeks after Hazel Pruitt left Wiley, Sorrell came back. He arrived at the farm gate in the late afternoon on a Thursday. No truck this time, just him on foot from the county road, which was not how Wiley Sorrell normally operated. Opal was near the barn and saw him coming. She walked out to meet him. He stopped at the gate and did not try to open it. He stood with his hands in the front pockets of his jacket and looked at the east field for a moment before he looked at her. He said, "I heard about the contract." Opal said, "Word travels." Wiley said, "I'm not here about the contract." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man assembling something difficult out of components that do not fit together easily. "I have lost 80 acres of East Field in 15 years. Erosion. I knew it was erosion. I just did not know what to do about it. I told myself it was the weather. It was not only the weather." Opal said nothing. Wiley said, "I filed that complaint last year because I needed your project to fail, not because I believed it would cause drainage problems, because if it worked, it meant I had been wrong for 15 years, and I have been farming this ground since I was 26 years old." He stopped, started again. "I tried to buy your land because I thought I could manage the problem by owning it instead of solving it." The sun was low and the shadows from the fence-line trees were reaching long across the east field, thin parallel lines in the late light. Wiley said, "I don't know how to do what you did." Opal looked at him for a moment, at this 54-year-old man with 80 dead acres and a lifetime of pride that had cost him more than he had admitted to anyone before this afternoon. She said, "You start at the fence line, you choose the right species, and you document everything from week one because the proof is in the data and the data takes time." Wiley said, "Will you help me?" Opal said, "Talk to Leland Teller first, then come back and I'll walk your east boundary with you." Wiley nodded once. He looked at the fence line one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the county road, his hands still in his jacket pockets, his steps unhurried, in the way of a man who has finally put down something he has been carrying for a long time and is not yet sure how to walk without the weight of it. Opal watched him go. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn, and as she walked, she pulled the field notebook from her back pocket and made a note of the date and the conversation in the same handwriting in the same notebook, because everything that happened on this farm went into the record, and this was something that had happened on this farm. The Callaway County Annual Agricultural Yield Report was published on a Thursday morning in the first week of November, and by noon that day, Leland Teller had already read it 3 times. He drove out to the Hollins farm that afternoon without calling first. Opal was in the east field checking the late harvest rows when she heard his truck on the gravel. She came in to find him standing at the kitchen table with a printed copy of the report in his hand. Vera was standing near the counter, arms folded, watching him with the expression she wore when she was waiting for something to be confirmed that she already believed. Leland set the report on the table and pointed to the line. Opal read it once. Then she read it again. Callaway County Organic Vegetable Production per Acre Yield Calendar Year. Hollins Farm East Field. Highest recorded in county history. She picked up the report and read the full page. Set it down. Leland was watching her face. Vera had not moved from the counter. Opal said, "Is the methodology clean? Can anyone challenge the measurement?" Leland said, "The county uses standardized reporting across all farms. Same protocol for everyone. There is nothing to challenge." Opal nodded. She picked the report up a second time, folded it once along the spine, and walked out through the kitchen door to the barn. Leland looked at Vera. Vera looked at the door. A minute later, Opal came back without the report. Leland said, "Where did you put it?" Opal said, "In the barn." Leland said, "I was going to have it framed." Opal said, "The barn is where it belongs." Vera turned back to the counter and said nothing, but Leland saw the small movement of her shoulders that in Vera Hollins's particular language meant she was pleased. 2 weeks after the report was published, Wiley Sorrell filed another document with the county. This one was not a complaint. It was a petition signed by Wiley and 4 other Callaway County farmers requesting that the County Agricultural Advisory Board convene a formal technical review of the yield report methodology. The language was careful and the tone was measured, but the intent was readable. They wanted the numbers examined before they were allowed to stand as county record. Vance Tanner sent Leland Teller a letter informing him of the petition and requesting that a technical representative appear before the board to address the methodology questions. Leland called Ines Greer that same afternoon. Ines said, "When?" Leland said, 3 weeks. Ines said, "I'll be there." Leland told Opal she should not attend. He said it without apology. The board session was a procedural and technical review, and Opal's presence would shift the room's attention from the data to the person, and the data was what needed to be in the center. Opal listened to his reasoning and agreed, which cost her something, because she was not a person who was comfortable letting other people stand in rooms on her behalf. She spent the morning of the board session driving the fence line on the tractor at half speed, doing maintenance checks on the tree spacing and soil at the base of each trunk, working in the cold November air with the particular focus of someone who needs their hands busy because their mind is somewhere else. The board session lasted 2 hours. Leland presented the methodology documentation. Ines testified as an independent expert. Vance Tanner asked her one question that mattered. He said, "Dr. Greer, in your professional assessment, is the yield performance documented at the Hollins farm a product of this specific system and this specific farm's characteristics, or is it a result that could be reproduced on other farms in this county under similar conditions?" Ines said the underlying principles are universal: wind protection, soil, moisture retention, nitrogen deposition from native species. These are documented agricultural phenomena. The results at Hollins Farm are consistent with what the science predicts. Whether another farmer sees similar results depends entirely on whether they implement the system correctly. Vance said, "Why has no one in this county done it before?" Ines said, "Because no one taught them before they started losing ground." The room was quiet for a moment. Clem Lorne was seated in the back row of the public gallery. He had not been listed as a petitioner on Wiley's document, which Leland had noticed and noted without comment. Clem did not speak during the session. He sat with his arms folded and his jaw set, and he listened to everything that was said about the science and the methodology and the 4 years of documented results from a fence line on a farm he had stood at every morning one spring and laughed. The petition was dismissed. The yield record stood. In the parking lot afterward, Wiley Sorrell was waiting near Leland's truck. Leland had been expecting confrontation. What he got instead was a man standing with his hands at his sides in the cold afternoon air, his breath visible, looking at the ground. Wiley said, I want to submit an EQIP application. Leland looked at him. Wiley said, I have 220 feet of east fence line that is in the same condition the Hollins line was in 4 years ago, maybe worse. He paused. I know I have no right to ask you for help after everything, but I'm asking. Leland said, come to my office Monday morning. Bring your property survey and your last 3 years of soil data, if you have any. Wiley said, I don't have soil data. Leland said, then come anyway. We'll start from where you are. Wiley nodded. He walked to his own truck without looking back. Leland watched him go and thought about the 23 letters he had written that nobody had answered, and about what it had cost him to keep writing them, and about what it had cost Wiley Sorrell to walk across a parking lot and say those words. He called Opal on the drive back. He told her the petition had been dismissed. He told her about Wiley in the parking lot. Opal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good. Make sure he fills out the application correctly, and tell him to use native species, not commercial nursery stock. Leland said, I'll tell him. Opal said, tell him before he orders the trees, Leland, not after. Leland understood what she was saying and why she was saying it that way, and he did not add anything to it. The following week, Clem Lorne drove to the Hollins farm, not past it, to it. He pulled up at the gate in the late afternoon on a day when the sky was the color of old iron and the temperature had dropped enough to make the field work uncomfortable, which meant Opal was still out there because that was the kind of farmer she was. She came in from the east field and found him standing at the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the fence line. The trees were bare now in the November cold, their branch structure visible against the gray sky, 11 feet of established growth, the bark thickening and roughening in the way of trees that have been in the ground long enough to stop being saplings and start being permanent. Clem had not come to the gate of the Hollins farm in 4 years. He had driven past it many times. He had stood at the wire on the other side many times. Coming to the gate was different. Coming to the gate meant he was asking for something. Opal stopped 10 feet from him and waited. Clem did not look at her right away. He looked at the trees. He said, I lost 31% last year. Between the drought and the input costs and the market price on corn, I lost 31% of what I made the year before. He paused. I have been farming 220 acres for 30 years, and I have never had a year like last year. Opal said nothing. Clem said, I stood at that wire 4 years ago and told you that you were wasting your ground. He was quiet for a moment. I want you to know I have not forgotten saying that. Opal said, I haven't forgotten it either. Clem looked at her then. There was something in his face that had not been there before, not regret exactly, because Clem Lorne was not a man who wore regret openly, but the specific sobriety of a person who has run the same calculation enough times to accept the answer. He said, I don't know how to do what you did. I need someone to show me. Opal said, have you talked to Leland Teller? Clem said, he's helping me with the EQIP application. Opal said, then you already know what comes next. You start at the fence line. You measure everything from week 1. You don't skip weeks. Clem said, I know. Opal said, you plant the right species. Leland will give you the list. Clem said, I know that too. He stopped. I'm not asking for a tutorial, Opal. I'm asking if you'll be there when I don't understand something. Opal looked at him for a long moment, at this 57-year-old man who had spent 4 years being wrong about something and was now standing at her gate in the cold, asking for help in the only way he knew how to ask. She said yes. Clem nodded once. He looked at the fence line one more time, at the trees that had been saplings when he had called them sticks and predicted they would be firewood. Then he said quietly, mostly to himself, 4 years is a long time to wait. Opal said, the trees didn't mind. Clem almost smiled. He got in his truck and drove back up the county road, and Opal stood at the gate and watched him go, and she thought that was probably the closest Clem Lorne had ever come to saying he was sorry and that it was enough. That evening, Leland came by the farm for the second time that week. He sat at the kitchen table with Opal and Vera, and he said what he had been working up to saying for some time. He said, I knew about EQIP before you planted the first tree. Opal looked at him. Leland said, I did not tell you about it in the beginning because I made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong. I thought that if you knew you could recover 75% of your planting costs through a federal program, you might approach the project as something insured rather than something at risk. I thought the risk was part of what would make you document everything the way you documented it. He looked at the table. That was not my decision to make. Opal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew about EQIP before I planted the first tree too. Leland looked up. Opal said, I researched every USDA conservation program available in Missouri before I came home. EQIP was on the list. I chose not to apply in year 1 because I needed to know the system worked before I asked a federal agency to fund its expansion. I needed the proof for myself before I needed it for anyone else. Leland said, You never told me that. Opal said, You never asked. Leland sat with that for a moment. Then he said, If I had told you from the start, would it have changed anything? Opal said, No, but it would have been honest. Leland said, Yes, it would have. He looked at her directly. With Clem, I told him about EQIP in our first meeting, before he decided on species, before he ordered a single tree. Opal said, Good. Leland said, I'm going to do that with every farmer I work with from now on. Every program, every resource, every option that exists, told up front before the first shovel goes in the ground. Opal said, That's what it should have always been. Leland nodded. Then he said, I also want to tell you that Ines finished the paper. Opal was quiet. Leland said, She submitted it to the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation last week. 4 years of your data, the thermal analysis, the yield comparison, the EQIP application results. She listed you as a co-author. You do not have to accept the listing, but she wanted you to have the option. Opal looked at the window. Outside, the east field was dark. I told her she could write whatever she wanted when I had a yield number. Leland said, You have a yield number, the highest in county recorded history. Opal said, Then she should publish it. She accepted the co-author listing the following day. Clem Lorne planted his fence line the following April. 180 saplings, the same 3 species Leland had recommended, spaced to Opal's documented protocol. Leland helped him complete the EQIP application, and the cost share approval came back in 6 weeks. Clem's out-of-pocket cost for the entire planting was $48. He called Opal the evening of the day the saplings went in. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the newest field notebook, making notes on the spring soil moisture readings. She picked up the phone and heard Clem's voice, which sounded different from how it usually sounded, not lighter exactly, but less compressed. He said, $48. I could not believe it when I saw the final number. Opal said, the program has been there the whole time. Clem said, Leland told me about it before I ordered a single tree. He sat down with me and went through every option before I made any decisions. A pause. That is not how it went for you. Opal said no. Clem said, I owe you more than I can say. Opal said, you don't owe me anything, Clem. You did what farmers do. You watched until you saw proof, and then you acted on what you saw. Clem said, 4 years is a long time to make someone wait for proof. Opal said, the trees didn't mind. There was a pause on the line, and Opal thought she could hear Clem outside because there was wind noise behind his voice, and she had a clear picture of him standing at his own fence line in the April evening, looking at the row of saplings he had just put in the ground, small and bare against the Missouri sky. He said, when I see results, I'm going to tell anyone who asks. I'm going to tell them before they ask. Opal said, that's the only thing I want from you. In May, Vance Tanner called Opal for the 3rd time. The first 2 calls had been professional, the call about the board session and a follow-up call about the petition dismissal. This one was different. He said, I am forming an advisory working group on sustainable agricultural practices for the county board. I would like you to be part of it. Opal said, I'm a farmer, not an advisor. Vance said, that is precisely why I'm asking. Opal said, I need to think about it. She talked to Leland that evening. She said, he wants me to sit on a county advisory group. Leland said, are you going to? Opal said, I don't know what I would be there. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an extension agent. I'm not a policy person. Leland said, you're the person who did the thing everyone said couldn't be done and then documented it well enough that no one could argue with the results. That is a specific and rare thing to be. Opal said, Vance will use me as an example. Leland said, yes, he will. The question is whether being an example is useful or whether it costs you something you're not willing to spend. Opal thought about her father sitting alone in front of a county board in 1999, the only vote for something he believed in, armed with research and conviction, and nothing else, walking home afterward to try it on his own because no one would try it with him. She called Vance Tanner back the next morning. She said, I'll join the working group under 2 conditions. Leland Teller is also invited, and the first agenda item is a practical guide to EQIP and available conservation programs for every farm in the county, not a presentation, a working document that farmers can take home and use. Vance said, both conditions are reasonable. Opal said, and I represent my own farm. I don't speak for anyone else's situation. Vance said, that is all I want from you. Opal said, then yes. She told Leland that evening. He said, your father tried to change how this county thought about its land from inside the boardroom. They voted him down 4-1. Opal said, I know. Leland said, you're going back in. Opal said, with 4 years of data and a county record and a federal program that pays 75% of the cost, it's different. Leland said, it is different. Opal said, and this time I'm not going alone. The first working group meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in the county extension conference room. 9 people around a table, farmers and extension staff, and 1 representative from the USDA regional office. Opal arrived early and set a folder at each place. Inside each folder was a 2-page document she had written herself, not in scientific language, but in the plain, direct language of someone who works the ground every day. It described what she had planted, why she had planted it, what it had cost, what it had returned, and exactly how to access the federal programs that had made the economics work. At the bottom of the second page was Leland's direct phone number and the NRCS website address. She also set 1 more document on the table. She placed it in the center where everyone could see it. It was the 1999 County Board proposal, the 4-page document with the 5 names at the bottom, the 4 who had voted against it, and the 1 who had voted for it alone. Vance Tanner came in, sat down, picked up the document, and read it. He looked at Opal. She said, 24 years ago, a farmer in this county tried to bring this conversation to this room. He had 1 vote. He went home and tried to do it alone and failed because he did not have the right support, and he never tried again. I want that document on record as the starting point for everything this group does, not as a failure, as a promise we are now in a position to keep. Vance said, I'll have it entered into the working group record. Opal said, good. Wiley Sorrell was not in the room that morning. He was on his own east fence line working. Leland had helped him submit his EQIP application the previous month, and it had been approved, and Wiley had ordered his saplings the week after approval. He was planting them now in the April ground, 1 tree at a time, along the boundary between his land and the Hollands property, the same boundary where he had stood for 3 years, and told himself that what Opal was doing was wrong. Opal knew he was out there. She could see his truck from the county road when she drove in that morning. She went to the working group meeting. She said what she had to say. She answered questions from people who had never heard of nitrogen-fixing species, and from people who had heard of them and never tried them, and from people who had tried something once and failed and were not sure why. She answered every question plainly and without condescension, the way a farmer answers another farmer who is asking in good faith. When the meeting ended, she drove home and changed her clothes and walked out to the east fence line. It was late afternoon, the light coming in low and warm from the west, and the trees were casting their long shadows across the field in the direction of the field center. 11 feet tall now, their canopies beginning to touch at the midpoints, forming a connected line rather than a series of separate trees. The ground at their base was dark and dense with organic material, 4 years of accumulated leaf fall and root work and nitrogen deposit, nothing like the pale compacted clay that had been there in the spring of 2019. She walked south, one hand occasionally reaching out to brush the bark of a trunk as she passed. The bark was rough and ridged, nothing like the smooth, flexible skin of the saplings she had carried out here 4 years ago. These were not saplings anymore. They were trees. They had mass and permanence and a root system that went deeper than any drought could reach. She was near the south end when she saw her mother. Vera was standing at the base of the first tree, the tree at the south end of the line, the position where the planting had started. She had her right hand flat against the bark, not gripping it, just resting her palm there, and she was very still. Her head was slightly bowed. Opal came up beside her and did not speak. After a while, Vera said, without raising her head, "I think about your father when I walk this line." Opal waited. Vera said, "I never asked him why he left. I thought I knew. I thought it was the farm, the debt, the years of difficult seasons. But standing here, I think maybe I was wrong about that. I think maybe it was the other thing. Being right about something and having no one believe you, and then failing the one time you try to prove it." She paused. "That can break a man in a way that debt and hard seasons don't." Opal said, "Yes, I think that's what it was." Vera lifted her hand from the bark and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the tree at the full height of it, against the sky, at what 4 years of undisturbed growth had made of a 22-inch sapling that had been pulled from the ground once and replanted. She said, "He would have laughed at you too in the beginning." Opal said, "I know." Vera said, "He would have stood at this wire with the others." Opal said, "Probably." Vera said, "And then he would have been the first one to come back." Opal looked at her mother. Vera was still looking at the tree, at the bark under her hand, and her face had the expression of a woman who has carried something for a long time and is finally setting it down in a place where it will be safe. Opal said, "That's why I planted them." Vera nodded once. She put her hand back against the bark for another moment, then she dropped it to her side and turned and walked back toward the house, her steps unhurried in the evening light. Opal stayed at the fence line a while longer. The shadows from the trees were reaching all the way to the center of the field, now long and parallel in the late sun, and the field beyond the protected zone was catching the last of the afternoon light in the way open ground catches it flat and exposed, nothing interrupting the wind as it moved across the surface. She thought about Leland Teller, who had spent 4 years writing letters and was now sending case study emails to 47 extension agents in 12 counties. She thought about Ines Greer's paper, which had been accepted for publication and would appear in the journal in the fall, with Opal Hollins listed as co-author, with 4 years of handwritten field notebook data turned into a documented scientific record that would exist in university libraries and research databases long after the trees outgrew the charts that described them. She thought about Clem Lorne's saplings sitting in their holes on the other side of the county road, 18 inches tall, beginning the slow, invisible work that no one standing at a wire making predictions could see from the outside. She thought about her father, not the man who had left, but the man who had stood in front of a county board with a 4-page proposal and a single vote and the right idea at the wrong time. And she thought about the difference between his situation and hers, and the difference was not intelligence or courage or even knowledge, because Arlo Hollins had all 3 of those things. The difference was that he had done it alone and she had not. She reached into the front pocket of her field shirt. The folded paper was still there, soft, at the creases, now the paper worn thin from 4 years of being carried in and out of the field every working day. She had not opened it in a long time. She did not open it now. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the weight of a man's defeat and a daughter's answer, and then she put it back where it had lived for 4 years against her chest, and she turned and walked back to the barn. Inside, the county yield report was pinned to the wall above the workbench, unframed, slightly crooked. She had put it up there herself, and she had not straightened it because it was a working barn, and working barns are not galleries, but it was there visible every time she sat down to record measurements in the field notebooks that lined the shelf above it, and every time she looked at it, she read the same line that Leland Teller had read 3 times on a Thursday morning in November before driving out to tell her. Callaway County, organic vegetable production, per acre yield, Holland's Farm, highest recorded in county history. She sat down at the workbench and opened the current field notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she began recording the afternoon's measurements in the same handwriting she had been using for 4 years, in the same format, in the same careful columns, because the data did not stop at a county record, and the trees did not stop growing, and the work was not finished. It was in the way of all real things just beginning.